Hi, I'm Dean McKenzie, Acting Director of OSHA's Directorate of Construction. Today we want to talk a little bit about standards. Standards apply to almost everything you do. There's a rule for every activity that we use in developing communication towers and keeping that industry running. In safety and health, most of the standards are activity-based. So the activity you are performing will determine what standard applies. That you may have several standards that apply to a day's work. And it's important for an employer to understand each of these standards and those requirements. We want to talk a little bit about some of the OSHA standards. We have OSHA standards for 1910, the general industry standards for maintenance and operations activities. 1915, if you are doing work on a tower that happens to be in a marine facility or a shipyard, 1917 could apply. Then the construction standards for building a tower, for upgrading a tower, for modifications that are enhancements to the structure, the construction standards would apply. It's important for an employer to understand these. You cannot tell a state trooper you didn't know what the speed limit was. That won't get you very far. It's important for you to understand what the regulations that apply to your industry are as well. Scott will talk a little bit about some of the other consensus standards.
Yeah, Dean, I really appreciate the fact that you're taking the time to talk with us about it, because for James Rutlinger and myself, it's very near and dear to us that we have people understand the standards that apply to our industry and the scope of work they're doing each and every day. One of particular importance to us in our industry is the TIA, ANSI TIA 222 standard. It's a standard we use for the design of the antenna supporting structures. It's recognized by the IBC. It's utilized to help us make sure the structures are designed in a way that they'll perform to provide the coverage and the service necessary. Another important area that we've all been talking about here over the last few days as we discuss standards is the ANSI A10 series. We've talked about the fact that people in our industry have a lot of variations in the scope of work they perform. And the A10 series, as you've really pointed out to James and I as we're talking, apply to several of those areas. One that comes off the top of my head is scaffolding. With some of the work we're doing in our industry right now, that's becoming more and more important to discuss that. Another area that's kind of unique to you guys is they address safety nets. Not quite sure how we always apply safety nets to a structure, that's why we use other parts of fall protection, but for you guys, 268 safety nets is important, isn't it?
Correct.
Another thing that we want to look at is we look at the A92.2, and that has to do with aerial lifts. As we get more in small cell DAS and some of the stuff that's happening with our industry, we're seeing an increase in the use of aerial lifts on our sites. It's really important for us to pay attention to the fact that there are standards that speak to these, and as contractors working for owners or engineers, we need to be aware of the standards that apply to our specific scope. And James wants to talk about a few of them that are special to him and what he's been working on in the industry.
Thank you, Scott. And just as Dean and Scott have stated, we do have many consensus standards within the industry that apply to specific activity-based work. We also have some larger industry standards that are more broad-based. You mentioned the 222 standard, which is really a design and analysis standard for structures in their completed state. What we also have within the industry is the 1019A standard, which is the design standard for the communication towers under construction. This standard provides guidance for planning. It also provides guidance for both construction loading and strength requirements for that tower under construction. It also provides some excellent design and analysis requirements for very specialized tower construction equipment, such as gin poles, base-mounted hoists, and also some of the temporary bracing that we get into with this type of work. Now, for more general standards for design and operation of material handling and lifting devices, we refer to the ANSI or the ASME B30 series standards, which covers a broad array of more conventional equipment that is used for construction, all the way from cranes down to shackles and rigging blocks.
That's really important when we're looking at some of these standards and we're talking about them in the conversation. We recognize we're just scratching the surface here. And as we've talked about, it's important for us all to be students and recognize what does apply to the work that we're performing.
Absolutely. A lot of our standards don't get into the details and the real fine pieces that these industry specific targeted standards get into, and where we are silent on something, we will refer in enforcement settings to those consensus standards and the provisions therein. So it's really important that employers understand everything that applies to them. You have to know the law and the regulations for the work you do.
Well, it's neat when we look at what's happening in the industry, because James is going to talk about some upcoming standards as well. We said we're just scratching the surface here. He's going to touch on some of those, but what's really exciting is the partnership we have working as an industry with regulators to really understand what we need to do to continue to improve some of these consensus standards as well.
Yes.
And James, maybe you want to talk about a couple
Absolutely.
exciting standards coming forward here.
So, some of the great improvements that are working to actually get published and hopefully released later this year is actually a split with a 1019A standard. And currently that standard contains essentially both design and use requirements for towers under construction. So it's really written to two main audiences, the contractors and to the engineers. That standard, because of that, has become a little confusing to read for those two different audiences and really navigating what information really pertains to them. So because of that, the TIA committee and working with ANSI and ASSE has made the split of the 1019A standard into two unique standards, both tailored to their specific audiences. We have the ANSI 322 standard that again is being in the final balloting stages at this point, and we're hoping to get that released later this year if all goes well. And that standard is really written specifically to the engineers that are taking into account the construction loading, the strength reductions of the towers under construction, and also providing the design guidance for some of these more specialized tower lifting devices that are being utilized. With the A10, we're also adding a new A10 standard that you'd already mentioned, and it'll be the A10.48 standard. And that's going to be the operation and use standard that's going to be written directly for the contractors, that provides those means and methods, again, while filtering out some of the math that might not be quite as of interest to that audience.
Well, it really gets down to the means and methods in the 1048, and I think it's important to see what's happened with our industry. It's a time of maturation. The number of people that have been involved in the 1048 and the 322, I mean, we've got NATE and their participation, we've got TIA, PCI, all parts of the industry are coming together now to contribute to these standards because we recognize the import of them. In a special way, we want to think about Ernie Jones and the leadership that he showed in these standards. But think about it from a contractor's point of view. You as an owner, if you were an owner, come in and say you need the structure to be modified. How do I do that work well? And that's what the industry is doing, is working with these different standards, both the existing, which we all need to be aware of and how they apply to our SAL, and these new exciting upcoming standards and how they'll help us do our work better every day.
And we have in the past used the consensus standards in enforcement settings when things have gone terribly wrong, and our standards are not specific enough to get to the root cause of an incident or issue, and it will continue to as these continue to develop. These become important parts of the industry work and getting the work done. The last thing I'd like to add is it's important to recognize for the employers, every standard is written in blood. Somebody was hurt that led to that rule. And the sooner that we recognize that and take that impact to heart, you understand more the importance of knowing these regulations. And you can find almost all of these available at any OSHA office around the country. There's 87 area offices around the country, any of the regional offices or the national office. You're welcome to come in and you can view these standards there. And we have folks that will be happy to help you understand the impact on your world.
So in closing, one of the things we'd like to do is thank everyone for their time, recognize we were just trying to give an introduction to the standards, and just raise the awareness that based on your scope of work, what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, you need to do the research for those standards. In the closing of the video, there's going to be some websites that'll be available for people to reference and see some of this information. As Dean mentioned, the OSHA area offices will support you, and these websites are important tools for you to be able to utilize as well. We'd like to thank you for your time. Please share the information and help us to continue to improve as an industry.